Hello and welcome to the PHP framework series. In this series, we will build together a PHP framework that's based on Symfony and Spring. In this video, we will see in a small presentation what we will be building this series, and we will also start our setup. Let's jump into it. So first, we will talk about what we will build. Then we will see what are components and what are starters. We have the request and response lifecycle and a directory overview. After that, we'll jump into the code. So what will we build? So we'll build a small PHP framework. It will be annotation based as PHP now supports it. We will do config by code, and only the properties will be in YAML. So we'll also do some YAML parsing. We will have a service container with dependency injection. So the framework handles all our dependencies for us. We will have route resolving. So when we do a post on /API/users, then we know what method to need to execute. We will work with controllers, with models, and with views. So it's an MVC setup. We will do database integration. We will write a common library where we can then have multiple integrations, and we will do one integration. The same with the template. We will also have a template system integration. So it will mainly exist in two big parts. The one thing is components and the other one is starters. So to use the complete framework, we will need the starters, but the starters will use components. And components are usable standalone. It's core or common functionality, and it needs to be configured before we can use it. The starters will link components together. For example, the data for databases, we will have a starter. For web, we will have a starter. And it will provide default configurations for our components, which we then can override, but you can really quickly start developing with the framework. That's the goal of starters. Then the request and the response lifecycle. So the user starts here on top with an HTTP request, and from that HTTP request, we get it in our PHP superglobals. We create a request object. Once we have that request object, we will create our dependency injection container, which will, the first time the framework runs, will be quite slow because we will use reflection to detect all the services and stuff. But we will, in later videos, see how we do it. Cache this one and then have already a array that links all the services together, so we don't have to loop over all those clauses, and with reflection check if there is an annotation on it. After that, after the dependency injection container is initialized, we will find execute with the route resolver clause the correct controller with the correct methods and pass in the parameters we need. That controller will go through services, will maybe fetch data from a database. That's up to the user that's using the framework. But in the end, it will render a view. Is it just a JSON? Is it a real HTML file? Is it a template that needs to be parsed? It's rendering a view. After that, the view is rendered in a response object, and then that response object will have a send method or some sorts, and that will then send the response back to the client. So we'll have this is the directory structure of the framework itself. So we have first a folder components and the folder starters, and under that components we'll start with DI, which stands for dependency injection. We will have a folder data for our database things or file system. It just everything with data, and we will also have a web folder, and in components it's mainly the request and the response objects that will be in there. Under starters, we have web, which will then link our request with a sort of kernel. It's a Symfony called. It's a kernel. Maybe we'll also call it a kernel. It links the dependency injection data and web bits together, and we also have a starters data. So the common layers are in components, and then the real integration, for example, with Postgres or MySQL, will be in the starters. And that's the directory structure for the framework, which that's what we are starting with. The directory structure of the usage of the framework, we will have a cache folder, so we will cache some stuff, so we don't always have to search for every class and use reflection. We will have a config. Like I said, we only will support properties in the config, but we want to have multiple environments as well, so it will be under the config folder. We have a logs folder for logging. We have a public, which is the entry point and where you should save all the CSS and JavaScript if needed, or images if you want to build a full website. The public will only have an index.php if you're building an API with the framework. That's okay. We have our SRC, so our source folder, which will be our controllers, our services, our repositories to go to the database, etc. The real code for with the framework usage is here, and then we have templates if we want to render templates, or anything else. So that's a bit what we will be building this series. So now let's go into the code and let's set up the first modules. Okay, I jumped into my IDE. I'm using IntelliJ, but you can use PHP, Storm, or VS Code, or whatever IDE you wanna use. The important thing is that if you wanna follow along, the directory structure is the same, and that you use Composer the correct way. And how to install Composer will be linked in the description. So first things first, I will start with creating two new modules in my project, which will be under the folder PHP-Boot, and the first module is for me framework. Create. Okay. I'll delete it, and I will create another module for me, example usage. That's all, just how we will use our framework. So it's a bit of a setup at the moment just to have it in all one IntelliJ project. So in our example usage, we will, of course, let's start with framework. We will first create a module for dependency injection. So we'll have a new PHP model under framework, and we'll call it, and we'll put it as well under the components. Components, and we'll call it dependency injection. And we'll add a composer file. That's okay. So the composer file needs to be under there. What needs to be in that file at the moment? Well, I need a name. So the name will be PHP-Boot /di for dependency injection. Our minimum stability will be dev because we'll link all those things up locally. We require some dependencies in the beginning, and the only thing at the moment will require PHP, and it needs to be a bigger version than 8.3. So that's the latest PHP version, and we'll target this one for our framework development. Then we also need to provide the autoload. We have PSR4. We need to put in our namespace, which will be PHP-Boot di, and this will link to our source folder. So our source folder will know that's the root of PHP-Boot di. We'll create that folder as well. And then we will eventually need repositories. At the moment, we'll just leave it empty, but in other modules, we will need it already. Okay, so that's the first one, and we'll configure it further in a moment. We'll create another module, and we'll call this one HTTP. This is where the request and response objects will live, which is also under components. Yes. Just again, a PHP. We'll create it. Press OK. And we'll delete this composer.js file, and we'll copy and paste our di composer.json into HTTP. Of course, we need to change the name, HTTP. Again, dev, our namespace will be HTTP. And we will as well have a source directory. So we will also already have a directory starters. And we will as well already create one starter. So let's create another module, this time under starters. And this module we'll call web. Great. That's okay. It always creates a composer, but we don't need it. We'll copy paste it from HTTP again. Let's press OK. So in here, we will call it PHP-Boot web. Again, we'll require PHP, call this one web. But web will need, and we already know it, web will need dependency injection and HTTP. So what we will do is we'll create some repositories with the type of path. So it's to our local file system with the URL, and then it's your full path. So for me, it's home about documents. I think then it's PHP-boot framework. Then I have my components folder, and then dependency injection, and we will as well configure options. So use symlink, and we'll put that to true. So we use symlinks. We can copy and paste this one and change the path to HTTP as well, because we need both. And then in our require, so we require those dependencies. So we'll say we need php-boot /di. And what version do we need? Well, we are developing it, so we put at dev. That's why we put our minimum stability as well for dev. We can duplicate this one, and we as well need HTTP. And you can see that IntelliJ will resolve those things. Okay, now we need to go to every composer JSON file, and we need to do a composer install. In IntelliJ, they have a plugin, and I can just call install, and it just does composer install. There's just no interaction. But you can see that we have our vendor here. So that's the dependency injection done. We'll do the HTTP. It's also a success. Let's check. Yeah, we have a vendor folder. Great. And then we do our starters, which we also will do. And you can see that we have now 2 installs of dependencies, which is HTTP and dependency injection. So if we now view our vendor, you can see that we have a folder PHP-Boot, DI, and HTTP are in there. Last but not least, for our framework development, we need to go to our project structure in IntelliJ. We need to do this for every module. We need to put the sources, and we want to prefix this one already with PHP-Boot, package prefix DI. So that if we create a class in IntelliJ with PHP class, that it already has that namespace, basically. And we will always exclude the composer folder from vendor for every module. So let's do it for HTTP as well. PHP-Boot backslash HTTP. Okay, and we will exclude our composer. Then we have web. We mark it as a sources folder, PHP-Boot web. Okay, and we'll exclude that one. To see what I'm talking about, so now if I go on my folder and I say new PHP class, you can see the namespace is already filled in, which is quite nice. Okay, so that's the setup for our framework. Now let's create the folders for our example usage. So our first folder we'll create is cache. Let's keep these folders lowercase all. We want a config. We want logs. Another directory public. Another directory for the source. Another directory for templates. And we want to initialize our composer file. Okay. So let's fill in those things. First, we'll put a type, which is a project for this one. We don't have a name. The description is also not needed. We'll put dev, no license, no authors at the moment. What do we require? So we require PHP again, and the version needs 8.3 or higher. And we want PHP boot / web. And that's it. So web pulls in dependency injection and HTTP. So if we pull in our starter, then it will work. We need to do our autoload again, PSR4, and our namespace will just be app, and the folder is source. But now we need to put in all those repositories, which is a bit of a pain. But when you publish everything on packages, this is not needed. But for the moment, we just need to do it. So let's copy it from web. And we need, of course, to add the web as well. So we have starters, web. Okay. Now we should be able to run Composer install. And as you can see, it pulled in 3 dependencies. So web has a dependency on DI and HTTP, so Composer pulls in everything, which is nice. The only thing we need to do is go back to project structure, and in example usage we want to exclude cache because it will generate PHP files that we don't want to have in our indexing or code completion. Logs, just the same, it doesn't need to scan it. And then again the composer, but you can see that it's already done, and it excluded everything else in vendor as well. Great. What we need to do is mark the source as sources folder, and our prefix is app. Okay. We'll apply, And again. And this is it. Now we are ready to start developing our framework. I hope to see you guys in the next video. See you. Bye bye.